We begin with a significant escalation in the DOJ's investigation into Donald Trump, the former president, and his attempts to overturn the results of the 2020 election so that he could stay the president. The DOJ has issued about 40 subpoenas in just the last week alone related to the actions of Donald Trump and the people closest to him, according to sources familiar with the matter. They also seized the phones of two top advisors to Donald Trump, Boris Epshteyn, a lawyer, and Mike Roman, a campaign strategist, the New York Times is reporting. A source who spoke to Epshteyn confirmed to NBC News that his phone was taken last week. Among the people who are receiving subpoenas in this moment, Bernard Kerik, a former New York City police commissioner who helped his old friend Rudy Giuliani, I might add, promote claims of voter fraud, false claims of voter fraud. Dan Scavino, Trump's former social media director, also was subpoenaed. People familiar with the case told the New York Times. To date, the DOJ has already arrested over 800 different people involved or connected to the attack on the Capitol and the insurrection on January the 6th. But this wave of subpoenas to Trump's allies suggests that they're focusing now on people at the top of the pyramid chain, the planners, the leaders, seeming to be going beyond the investigations up to date of the people who simply stormed the Capitol itself. And it does make you wonder if the federal probe may have been one of the topics that Trump and a group of other men were discussing here on his golf course in Virginia. Of course, we have no idea what they were talking about in this video, which was taken from really, really far away and well out of earshot. But as somebody who is the daughter of a dad who has a handicap of 3, who plays golf literally every single day of the week, I have never once seen him standing around a golf course with 10 other people where no one is holding any golf equipment at all. Like, it's just very strange to see this. Here to break it all down, though, in the legal context, Asher Ben-Gappa, unless she's an expert on golf as well, former FBI special agent, also Carol Lam, a former U.S. attorney and an MSNBC legal analyst. Asha, I'll start with you. What does this wave of subpoenas to Trump allies tell you about the DOJ's investigation into the insurrection, or even the idea that Donald Trump was attempting to overturn the election more broadly?
Yes, Zerlina. So I think that this wave of subpoenas is building on the grand jury testimony that DOJ got several weeks ago, or a little over a month ago, from two lawyers close to Trump, Patrick Philbin and Patrick Cipollone. And, you know, it's getting to the inner circle around Trump in terms of what was going on with this fake elector scheme, this and the legal blueprint behind that fake elector scheme. What was especially notable to me was the seizure of the two phones that you mentioned. A seizure happens much farther into an investigation than the subpoena. So that tells me that there are portions of this investigation that have proceeded to a point where the Department of Justice has probable cause to convince a judge that there will be evidence of a crime on the phones that have been seized. And getting to these communications that may be on these phones is really critical to establishing conspiracy, because conspiracy is all about an agreement to commit a crime. So you really need to know what these people were communicating and talking about, what they were agreeing on. The only other thing I'll add is that it looks like DOJ has also requested some of the recipients of these subpoenas to turn over documents that they provided to the House committee. And that tells me that the Department of Justice is largely following a blueprint that's been laid out for them by the January 6th committee. In other words, they have a lot of leads from the testimony that we've heard so far publicly.
And Carol, as Asha just mentioned, the seizure of the phones definitely stood out to me as well. I was like, interesting. And again, they're not the only folks close to Trump who have had their phones seized by a legal search warrant. There have been others previously, and now the latest are Boris Epshteyn and Mike Roman. Why do you think that's significant? Do you agree with Asha that this is a significant development? And what are some of the federal statutes that you're thinking of when you're looking at this set of facts as we know them as the DOJ continues this investigation?
Well, as a former fraud prosecutor, I'm always interested in the fraud aspects of things. And it does sound like what they're looking at now, in addition to the fake elector scheme and some of the January 6th events, they're also looking at the possibility of the Save America Fund, which is a PAC, being actually a fraud where people were told one thing in order to get them to give money, and then that money was misdirected and used for a different purpose. So I'm always interested in that. But getting back to the seizure of phones, what Asha said is correct. There's a different standard for executing a search warrant than there is for a grand jury subpoena. There's a higher standard. You have to meet a probable cause standard in order to get a search warrant. But the reason I can see that they would use a search warrant for the phones is because they want to make sure that people don't get onto those phones and start deleting information. Because with the grand jury subpoena, you have to give the person time to respond to the grand jury subpoena. You have to give them at least usually a couple of weeks, unless you have very special cause to require what they call a forthwith subpoena, where they say, give us the documents now. But that's very, very unusual. But with a search warrant, you just go in and you get the item immediately. And it sounds like they had some sort of agreement with the attorney that phone would be turned over, those phones would be turned over immediately. So that's why you would use a search warrant in that context. And it does sound like they probably, as Asha mentioned, they probably got some information that text or WhatsApp or some other kind of communication was being used on those phones where there might be a record of the communication.
And Asha, one of the things I've been thinking about the last couple of weeks related to what Carol just explained there is that, fraud is something that has come up recently. Also, financial crimes, or even the documents case that we've been talking about for the past couple of weeks. But it still feels like there should be something we can charge people with related to the attack on the actual Capitol, right? I mentioned in the intro, there are 800 individuals who have been charged with crimes because they stormed into the Capitol and did violent things. They committed acts of violence. And in many cases, they're charged with like illegally trespassing and other things related to the attack on the Capitol. Why is the DOJ looking into all of these other things and seemingly, at least from the outside, not looking at that thread that connects Donald Trump to the actual violence we saw on January 6th? Or maybe I'm overthinking.
Yeah, I wouldn't discount that they are looking at the connection between Trump or his inner circle into the violence. The problem there, Zerlina, is that the crimes that would actually implicate that you would need to charge, Trump or his inner circle with, things like seditious conspiracy, require a very direct connection between the individual and the use of force. So, in other words, you would have to show that Trump, that Mark Meadows, that these people agreed on, that they planned for this violence to happen. And I'm not saying that can't be proven, but it's a much more difficult link to create a case on and then to prove that case beyond a reasonable doubt. I think that part of what could shed light on that are things like the communications that the FBI is going to find by seizing the phones, the two phones that we just discussed, but also John Eastman, Jeffrey Clark. I mean, were they discussing that this, fake elector scheme, all of these allegations of voter fraud, would be linked to agitating a crowd and getting them riled up with the intent to do that? I don't know, but if there's any evidence to be found, it would be likely in those types of back and forth conversations and communications, because you would have to establish that kind of knowledge and forethought and agreement.
It's a helpful explanation. Carol, last question here. With all of that Asha said in mind, do you think that they'll try to charge Trump with handling documents or something related to January 6th, both? I mean, how would they prioritize one set of charges over another if they end up having to do that?
Zerlina, when you're a prosecutor, it's a lot of people assume that the most serious charges, the most awful sounding behavior is what you charge. But actually, what you charge is the violation for which you have the best evidence. And I would only be speculating at this point as to what evidence the department actually has with respect to any set of these potential allegations. And on top of that, it's important to remember that there are a lot of political considerations that have to go into an analysis of whether you would ever charge a former president of the United States with a crime. And that's just a reality that I think that people have to keep in mind and understand that the Department of Justice, for a whole host of reasons that are legitimate reasons, has to keep that in mind. So it's not necessarily a foregone conclusion that even if evidence of a crime is there and even if it meets the very high bar, whether it is the right thing for the country to actually bring charges against a former president of the United States.
That's helpful analysis. I always like to remind people, though, I feel like we can take the DOJ rush to judgment off the table of complaints if there are eventual charges here. I feel like that complaint, that's not applicable in this case any longer. Asha Rangappa and Carol Lam, really helpful analysis to start us off. Thank you so much for being here. Please stay safe. Hi, I'm Zerlina Maxwell. Thanks for checking out our channel on YouTube. You can see more from Zerlina by clicking any of the videos on this screen, and make sure you subscribe below to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. Thanks for watching.